The blood of wolves, the shadow of the twin. The world remembers the empire, the marble columns and the invincible legions, but before the glory there was a scream in the wild. Before the crown there was a murder. This is not the history they taught you in school. This is the story of a man who birthed a civilization by slaughtering his own soul. This is the legend of Romulus, the boy who drank the milk of a beast and became the king of men. But as the sun sets over the 7 hills, a question lingers in the cold night air. Did Romulus build Rome to honor the gods, or to hide a sin that the earth refused to swallow? The air in the year 753 BC did not smell of incense or wine. It smelled of damp earth, predator musk, and the copper tang of fresh blood. Deep in the marshes of the Tiber, 2 infants lay in a wicker basket, tangled in the reeds. They were the sons of a Vestal virgin and a god of war, discarded like trash by a king who feared their prophecy. But the river did not drown them. The river delivered them to the mouth of a cave, the Lupercal. Imagine the silence of that cave, broken only by the low, guttural growl of a mother who had lost her cubs and found something else, a she-wolf. Most legends make this sound like a bedtime story. It wasn't. It was a brutal survival. To survive the wild, Romulus had to stop being human. He didn't just drink the milk of the wolf, he inherited its hunger. He watched his brother Remus and saw a reflection of his own growing darkness. They were 2 halves of a single soul, destined to collide. As they grew, the shepherds saw them as heroes, but the wolves saw them as kin. There was a restlessness in Romulus, a feeling that the horizon wasn't big enough for 2 kings. The suspense of the founding lies in the silence between the brothers. Have you ever felt a shadow following you, only to realize the shadow is your own blood? Romulus began to see omens in the sky. He saw vultures, 12 of them. Remus saw only 6. The gods had spoken, or perhaps Romulus simply heard what he wanted to hear. The tension was a physical weight, a storm cloud hovering over the Palatine Hill. Every stone Romulus laid for his wall was a line drawn in the sand. "Do not cross," he warned. But Remus, fueled by the same wolf blood, laughed. That laugh was the last sound Remus ever made. In a moment of red mist, the wall was stained. Romulus stood over the body of his twin, the only person who truly knew him, and realized that to lead a nation, one must be willing to be utterly alone. He didn't weep, he built. He built over the grave. Every street in Rome is paved over a brother's silence. But as the walls rose higher, the whispers began. The people looked at their king and didn't see a man. They saw the predator from the cave. The city grew, populated by outcasts, criminals, and the forgotten. Romulus offered them a home, but it was a home built on a foundation of theft. The neighbors, the Sabines, watched with growing dread. They had daughters, and Romulus had an army of lonely, violent men. The tension reached a breaking point during a festival. A celebration turned into a nightmare. In one coordinated strike, the rape of the Sabine women began. It wasn't just a kidnapping, it was a desperate, calculated move to ensure the survival of his seed. Romulus was playing a game of godhood, and the pieces were human lives. But the Sabines did not forget. They marched. The gates of Rome, supposedly impenetrable, swung open. Betrayal from within. Tarpeia, a woman blinded by the glitter of gold, let the enemy in, only to be crushed under their shields. The battle in the Forum was a meat grinder. Blood ran into the gutters of the city that was supposed to be eternal. And just as the swords were raised for the final slaughter, the women, the very ones who had been stolen, stepped between the blades. They chose their captors over their fathers. They chose Rome over their past. Romulus stood at the center of this chaos, a king who had won everything and lost his humanity. He ruled for 37 years, a reign of iron and shadow. But the higher you climb, the closer you are to the lightning. The senators, the men he had raised from the dirt, began to look at him with narrowed eyes. He had become too powerful, too much like the god he claimed to be. The mystery of his end is the greatest cliffhanger in history. On a day when the sky turned black and a storm tore the trees from the earth, Romulus vanished. One moment he was reviewing his troops, the next there was only empty air and the smell of ozone. The senators claimed he was taken by his father, Mars, into the heavens. They called him Quirinus. But as the soldiers looked at the senator's blood-stained robes, a darker theory took root. Did he ascend to the stars, or was he torn limb to limb by the very men he taught to be wolves? The ghost of Romulus didn't leave Rome. It stayed in the stone, in the law, and in the violence that would define the empire for 1,000 years. But the story doesn't end with a disappearing king. It begins with a secret buried under the Forum, a secret that suggests Romulus knew his end was coming. He knew that a city born in blood must eventually drown in it. As we look at the ruins today, we ask, was he a visionary or a monster who convinced the world his crimes were destiny? The silence of the Palatine Hill still holds the answer. If you listen closely on a stormy night, you can still hear the howl of the wolf and the echo of a brother's footsteps. But the true horror isn't what Romulus did to Remus, it's what he did to us. He taught us that to build something that lasts forever, you must first kill the part of yourself that feels mercy. The crown is heavy, but the shovel is heavier, and the earth of Rome is never, ever full.
The stolen crown, echoes of the Sabine cry. The walls were high, but the silence inside Rome was deeper. Romulus had secured the land, he had buried his brother, and he had carved a city out of the dirt. But a city without a future is just a graveyard waiting for its occupants. The men who followed Romulus were the dregs of Italy, thieves, runaway slaves, and killers seeking a fresh start. They had iron, they had walls, but they had no legacy. They had no women. And Romulus, with the cold calculation of a wolf, knew that a kingdom that cannot birth children is a kingdom that dies in a single generation. Imagine the desperation of 1,000 men watching the sun set over a city of stone, knowing that when they die, their names die with them. Romulus sent messengers to the neighboring tribes asking for the right of marriage. He was rejected with mockery. "Open a sanctuary for female criminals," the neighbors laughed, "and then you will have matches fit for your people." They didn't realize that you do not mock a man who was raised by a beast. You do not insult a king who has already killed his own blood to satisfy his ambition. The plan was hatched in the dark, under the flickering torchlight of the Palatine. Romulus announced a grand festival, the Consualia, dedicated to the god of the granary. He invited the Sabines, the wealthiest and most powerful tribe nearby. He offered them wine, games, and the illusion of peace. They came in their thousands, bringing their wives and daughters, lured by the promise of spectacle. But as the Sabines cheered for the chariot races, they didn't notice the Roman men tightening their grip on the hilts of their concealed daggers. They didn't see Romulus standing on a high pedestal, his purple cloak catching the wind like a funeral shroud. Then, the signal. Romulus stood and folded his cloak. In an instant, the music died and the screaming began. It wasn't a battle, it was a harvest. The Roman men surged into the crowd, seizing the young women, dragging them away into the shadows of the rising city. The Sabine men,
unarmed and betrayed, could only watch in horror before fleeing for their lives. This was the moment the world realized what Rome truly was, a predator that took what it wanted. But Romulus didn't just want bodies, he wanted a nation. He spent the following nights visiting the captive women, speaking not with the voice of a captor, but with the honeyed tongue of a politician. He told them they were not slaves, but wives. He told them their children would inherit the earth. But blood demands blood. The Sabines returned, led by the vengeful king Titus Tatius. They didn't come with flutes and wine this time. They came with spears and a hunger for total annihilation. The suspense of the siege hung over Rome like a choking fog. For months, the two armies stared at each other across the valley. The Romans were trapped in their own fortress, realizing that the walls Romulus built were now their cage. Enter Tarpeia, the daughter of the Roman commander, a girl whose heart was as hollow as the gold she craved. She looked at the Sabine soldiers' golden armbands and made a deal with the devil. "I will open the gates," she whispered, "if you give me what you wear on your left arms." She thought of the gold. The Sabines thought of their shields. As she swung the heavy oak gates open, the Sabines didn't shower her with gold. They threw their heavy shields, carried on their left arms, onto her, crushing the life out of her body until her bones were dust. The Tarpeian Rock became a monument to treason, a place where Rome would forever throw its traitors to their deaths. The gates were open. The Sabines poured in. The battle in the Roman Forum was a chaotic nightmare of mud and gore. Romulus himself was struck by a stone, falling to his knees as his men began to break and flee. In that moment of absolute terror, Romulus looked to the sky. He didn't pray for mercy, he demanded a miracle. He vowed a temple to Jupiter Stator, Jupiter the Stayer, if the god would stop the flight of his men. The air grew heavy, the wind roared, and the Romans turned back. But the most chilling moment of the war wasn't the fighting, it was the end. As the two sides prepared for a final suicidal charge, the Sabine women ran onto the battlefield. They were no longer the daughters of the Sabines or the captives of the Romans. They were the bridge. They stood between their fathers and their husbands, clutching their newborn infants to their chests. "For if you must kill, kill us, for we are the cause of this war." The swords lowered. The silence that followed was heavier than the roar of battle. Romulus and Titus Tatius met in the center of the carnage and did the unthinkable. They didn't just make peace, they merged. Two kings, one city, two peoples, one bloodline. It was a masterstroke of survival, but it planted a seed of paranoia in the heart of Romulus. He had to share his throne, he had to share his power, and for a wolf who had killed his twin to rule alone, sharing was a slow-acting poison. The years that followed were a blur of expansion and internal shadow-playing. Romulus and Tatius ruled together, but the air between them was cold. When Tatius was eventually murdered in a riot in a nearby city, Romulus did nothing. He didn't seek justice, he didn't mourn. He simply stepped back onto the throne as the sole ruler, his shadow stretching longer than ever before. He began to dress in a long tunic of scarlet, surrounded by a guard of 300 men called the Celeries. He was no longer a leader of shepherds, he was a tyrant in the making. The Senate, a body of 100 elders he himself had created, began to fear him. They saw a man who moved like a god and spoke like a storm. They saw a king who no longer consulted them, who made laws in the dark, and who looked at them as if they were prey. The suspense was no longer about foreign enemies, it was about the man sitting on the throne. Every time Romulus entered the chamber, the elders felt the air leave the room. The end act was approaching. Rome was a powerhouse, a city that had survived its own birth pains, but the creator was becoming a burden to the creation. Romulus had become too big for the world he built. And as the clouds began to gather on that fateful day at the Goat's Marsh, Romulus stood before his people for the last time. He knew
He could feel the eyes of the senators on his back, not eyes of respect, but eyes of steel. The legacy of Romulus is a warning. What is born in blood must be sustained by it. He stole a people to make a city, and now the city was ready to steal his life. The storm was coming, and in the darkness of the eclipse, the legend of the first king was about to reach its terrifying, vanishing conclusion.
37 years. For 37 years, Romulus had been the heartbeat of Rome. He had outlived his brother, outmaneuvered his rivals, and merged two warring nations into one. But the wolf who leads the pack eventually grows old, and in the world Romulus created, there was no room for weakness. The city was now a sprawling beast of stone and iron, and its creator had become a ghost walking among the living. The suspense that once lived on the battlefield had moved into the corridors of power. The Senate, the patres or fathers, no longer looked at Romulus with gratitude. They looked at him with a terrifying, silent hunger. Romulus had changed. He no longer walked the streets as a man of the people. He became a figure of dread, draped in a purple toga that looked like dried blood, always flanked by his 12 lictors carrying the axes of execution. He was the law, the judge, and the executioner. To the common people, he was a living god. To the 100 senators, he was a tyrant who had forgotten who put him on the throne. The air in Rome grew thick with the scent of a coming storm, a tension so sharp it felt like a blade pressed against the throat of the city. The date was July 5th. The place was the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, near a spot known as the Goat's Marsh. The entire Roman army was assembled for a review. Romulus stood on a high wooden tribunal, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was 60 years old, but his gaze was still that of the predator that had survived the wild. The senators stood behind him, a wall of white togas and hidden intentions. The sky, which had been clear and baking under the Italian sun, began to change with an unnatural speed. It started with a low hum in the air, the sound of the earth vibrating. Then the light began to fail, not the slow fading of a sunset, but a sudden, violent swallowing of the sun. An eclipse. In the ancient world, an eclipse was not a celestial event. It was the gods turning their backs on humanity. The soldiers began to whisper, their armor clanking as they shifted in fear. The wind rose to a roar, whipping the dust into a blinding frenzy. A tempest, the chroniclers call it, but it was more like a tear in the fabric of reality. In the middle of this swirling blackness, the people lost sight of their king. Thunder drowned out all screams. Lightning fractured the sky, turning the world into a series of jagged, frozen moments. And then, as quickly as it had arrived, the storm vanished. The sun returned, the wind died, and the dust settled. The tribunal was empty. Romulus was gone. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the storm. The soldiers looked to the senators, who stood there calm and unshaken, their hands tucked into the folds of their robes. "He has been taken," one of the elders whispered. "The king has ascended. Mars has claimed his son." The words spread like fire. Romulus was now a god. He was no longer a man. He was Quirinus, the divine protector of the Roman state. The people fell to their knees in awe, mourning their lost father while celebrating their new deity. But behind the closed doors of the Roman villas, a darker story began to leak out like poison. There were those who had been standing close to the tribunal during the darkness. They spoke of a different kind of storm. They whispered that the tempest was a distraction, a cover for a well-coordinated slaughter. They claimed the senators had surrounded Romulus in the dark, their daggers flashing in the gloom. The chilling detail? They didn't just kill him, they tore him apart. Each senator, it was said, took a piece of the king's body and hid it beneath their robes,
carrying the evidence of their crime away from the field to be buried in the secret corners of their own estates. Think about the horror of that moment. A city worshipping a god whose physical remains were rotting under the floorboards of the men who murdered him. The suspense of Rome's origin is built on this lie. Did he fly to the stars, or was he carried away in pieces in the pockets of his friends? The city was on the verge of a riot. The people suspected the Senate. They smelled the blood. Just as the uprising was about to burn Rome to the ground, a man named Proculus Julius stepped forward. He was a respected friend of Romulus, known for his honesty. He swore an oath that Romulus had appeared to him in a vision, taller and more radiant than any mortal, dressed in armor that shone like fire. "Go," the vision had told him, "and tell the Romans that it is the will of heaven that my Rome shall be the capital of the world." The lie worked, or perhaps it was the truth. The people were satisfied, the Senate was safe, and the mystery was sealed in the foundations of the empire. But the ghost of the twin killer, the thief of women, and the king of outcasts never truly left. Romulus became the blueprint for every emperor who would follow, men who would reach for divinity while their hands were soaked in the blood of their brothers. Rome would go on to conquer the world, but it would always be a city looking over its shoulder. It was a civilization founded on fratricide, built on abduction, and finished with a conspiracy. As the centuries passed and the marble turned to dust, the question remained: can a nation ever escape the sins of its father? The story of Romulus is the story of us. It is the realization that to build something eternal, something human must be sacrificed. The wolf is still there, deep in the heart of the stone, waiting for the next storm, the next eclipse, and the next king to claim the throne. The king is dead. Long live the god. But remember, in Rome, the walls don't just protect the living, they hide the dead. And some secrets are too heavy for even the earth to hold.